Okay, folks, so how many of you have ever done the Pepsi challenge where you taste test both Pepsi and Coke and try to identify it? Um, this was a big thing for a while. You have a picture here from when it first started, like in the 70s. Huge marketing gimmick for Pepsi. These days, I know soda has fallen out of vogue with a lot of us, so it may not be something you participated in. Although you'd be surprised by how many of the beverages out there that you might consume, even if they're not carbonated soft drinks, are probably owned by Coke or Pepsi these days. Anyway, I asked you to consider a few questions regarding this case. First, if the cola industry has traditionally been such a profitable industry, why have so few firms entered the business? And what barriers to entry exist? So here we are back with our old friend Porter's Five Forces. This is a model you're going to see an awful lot of, and you'll probably see it in your business career because people in industry do actually refer back to this model quite a bit. So here we're asking about barriers to entry. So that really focuses on this bucket up top, new entrants, the threat of new entrants. So there's this inverse relationship. When barriers to entry are high, then the threat of new entrants is low, and vice versa. So what are some of the barriers to entry that exist for concentrate producers like Coke and Pepsi? So I've identified a few. You may have thought of some others. Brand loyalty, scale in advertising. So remember, concentrate producers at times are separate from their bottlers. Sometimes they're combined under one roof, but right now we're really just focusing on concentrate producers. So the scale in manufacturing is probably less important here than advertising, because if you look at the financial information that's presented in the case, you see that Coke and Pepsi are essentially giant marketing agencies that also seem to sell soft drinks. They spend a lot of money on marketing. Bottling as a barrier to entry, there's only so many bottlers out there, and they have the relationships locked down with those bottlers, whether they're in-house or in exclusive contracts. And that goes with distribution as well, because those bottlers also manage distribution. And those relationships with grocery stores and other retailers where you might see soda on the shelves. And the final barrier to entry, this one's debatable, and we'll talk about it a little more in this video. Supplier relationships. Whatever goes into Coke and Pepsi, are other people able to imitate their recipe for those drinks easily? That's a good question. So these barriers to entry portray a pretty good picture of why, one reason why there are not a lot of new entrants. So we generally consider this a low threat. It is a very profitable industry, but it's hard to break into because of these barriers to entry. Next, I ask you to consider, how has the Coke and Pepsi rivalry impacted industry profitability from about 1970 onward? So then we're going back to that Five Forces model, but now we're focusing on this bucket, existing rivalry. So what are some of the factors that affect existing rivalry? This is where you think about industry structure. So you go dust off your old microeconomics textbook and think about, is this a monopoly, a duopoly, perfect competition? Well, it turns out in this case, it's a duopoly, which means there are two large players in this industry. You have to ask a few other qualitative questions about the nature of the competition. Are these two equally sized players? Is one much more powerful than the other? Are there some small players that we don't factor in because these two are so large? And you can kind of work through that on your own. But Coke and Pepsi are fairly equally matched. Is there a high degree of perceived differentiation? That's another question. So are they selling a commodity product? Is a can of Coke the same thing as a can of Pepsi? And this is another question to think about. Think about your own consumer behavior. If you are a Coke drinker or a Pepsi drinker, are you equally happy to substitute the other product? Not everyone is, and in part, this harkens back to the fact that these are two marketing powerhouses. People like the soda in part because of the brand and the image of it. So it wouldn't be quite so easy to substitute a Coke for a Pepsi. So I challenge you to think about what is the image and brand message that Coke presents and how is it different than Pepsi? And do you think that really presents sufficient product differentiation? Because the two products themselves are both fizzy brown drinks that come in cans and bottles. They're not too wildly different. The last piece I'd ask you to think about here for the existing rivalry to assess it is that these two are equally matched large companies that tend to imitate each other's strategies. Because they imitate each other's strategies, we call that tit for tat. One buys a Super Bowl ad, the other buys a Super Bowl ad. What ends up happening is that both of them are in this kind of escalating marketing war, if you will, that each one kind of wants to one-up the other. But what they do is they essentially lock out small upcoming players in the carbonated beverage market because a young upstart won't be able to afford that Super Bowl ad, doesn't have the same national scale. So it ends up reinforcing a lot of the barriers to entry. So in many ways, that duopoly structure, believe it or not, contributes to a low threat of existing rivalry. There's more ability also to coordinate amongst two players than there would be if there were many producers in the market. People tend not to believe me on this one. They think fewer competitors, oh, it must be a fiercer rivalry because it's always Coke versus Pepsi. But actually think about the industry characteristics and think about what it means to have a high threat of existing rivalry. Think about it in pricing terms. If there are lots of little competitors, it's hard to coordinate amongst them, and you will end up possibly in a price war or kind of meeting the lowest kind of common denominator on price. In this instance, Coke and Pepsi don't necessarily need to bottom out their pricing. They think of other ways to compete. So I like to harken back to Conan the Barbarian. This is a quote from that movie. What is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That's not the case in this industry. Coke and Pepsi, their rivalry in a lot of ways, makes each other stronger. In fact, one of the, I think, Pepsi execs in the case actually mentioned that. So, final question. Compare the economics of the concentrate business to that of the bottling business. Why is the profitability so different? And then use data or theoretical frameworks to support your answer. So here's how far we've gotten so far on the 5 forces model for concentrate producers. Let's talk about these other forces very briefly, because this is what I mean when I say the economics or structure of an industry. I'm referring to the Porter's 5 forces. The buyers in the market. Who buys soft drinks? Ultimately, it's individual consumers, you or me. Those end users, we're very fragmented. We don't have a lot of market power. But there's some intermediate players that actually purchase the drinks directly from Coke or Pepsi or their bottlers. So those are those retailers oftentimes, or restaurant franchises. You have your big box stores and your groceries, and they lay out a few different ways that Coke and Pepsi actually get into your hands as a consumer. But those retailers are less fragmented. They're more concentrated. So imagine it's not a big deal if you and I stop drinking Coke to Coca-Cola. It's a big deal if Walmart stops stocking Coke. So think about it that way. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, buying power. So we'll call it low or medium as far as forces go. Coke and Pepsi are products that consumers demand by name, so they have a little bit of star power. So if anyone's able to go head to head with a big retailer like Walmart, it would be a Coke or Pepsi. Substitutes. As this case points out, there are an awful lot of substitutes for Coke and Pepsi, and there is a growing list every day. Water, milk, juice, coffee, tea, generic sodas, etc., etc., etc. I'll put this challenge out to you to think about what is the difference between a substitute and an existing rival, because they are different. Water is a substitute for Coca-Cola. Pepsi is a rival. Think about why that is. But anyway, even though the power of these substitutes might be growing, like taking away market share from both Coke and Pepsi, there's still a healthy demand, especially if you look through the financial statements for Coke and Pepsi. So at this point, at the time of this case, we'd say this is kind of a low but growing force. And again, there's also the marketing aspect of it. I want a Coke because I like the brand image of Coke. Water doesn't give me the same cool brand image. These days, arguably, there are other competitors coming out. Fancy waters, teas, new age beverages that may actually be a more close substitute for Coke and Pepsi. Last but not least, the power of suppliers. Mystery ingredients. Nobody knows what goes into Coke and Pepsi. They keep their recipes secret. But the bottlers are the ones who actually add sugar or sweetener. They're the ones who add water, and they're the ones who put it in a bottle. So Coke and Pepsi themselves are just producing some flavorings, which is probably, well, it may be the higher value add. What they're really doing is creating this marketing and brand image, and the product they actually create, because we don't know what goes in it, the suppliers don't have a lot of power, and there's also not much that seems to go in it because they're producing one very small piece of the overall product. So we would probably classify that power as low. So again, look at this 5 forces. Look, low threat of new entrants, low to medium buyer power, low existing rivalry, low but growing threat of substitutes, low supplier power. This is kind of the ideal market setup for Coke or Pepsi. Now let's look at those bottlers. Are they? Do they have the same fate? There are some barriers to entry that don't exist that are slightly different than the ones for concentrate producers, right? The capital for the factory, the scale they need to produce, the relationship with concentrate producers. I'm actually not going to walk through this whole model because I would like you guys to give this some thought if you're thinking about revising your memo on your own, to think about how the 5 forces vary just for the bottlers in these different instances. I'd also urge you to use some of the financial data that's presented in the case to make your case as to why the two have different profitability. Don't just take my word for it, verify it with financial information. Before leaving you, I'll give you a little food for thought here. So if the bottlers are not that profitable, why would Coke or Pepsi take their bottlers in-house? Like, they're obviously doing very well on their own. They have a great kind of setup when it comes to the 5 forces. They have a lot of industry power. So why take those bottlers in-house? Think about it. So there's this idea called transaction cost theory. It's more efficient to do some activities as a firm, so in-house, than transact to the market. And in some ways, you can prevent a market failure. So what do I mean by market failure? Coke and Pepsi need to get their products to the market somehow. They really do need those bottlers, or they need their product to be bottled in some way, shape, or form. So if the bottlers are really suffering and not making profit, and possibly thinking about exiting the market, Coke and Pepsi are in trouble because they need those bottlers to exist. So if the bottlers are in trouble, Coke and Pepsi are in trouble. So it might make sense for them to prevent that market failure and take their bottlers in-house. The other piece